News First, face to face with Wijetilleke.
Hello and a very good evening. Welcome to another edition of Face to Face, coming to you live and direct from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Wijetilleke, and today my guest is no stranger to the show. He is Kusum Wijetilleke, working committee member of the Samagi Janabalawege. Welcome back, Kusum.
Thanks for having me, Jamal. Appreciate it.
Certainly. So, Kusum, I want to start off tonight's show on a rather unorthodox manner, because we often talk about fraud and corruption being the key elements that has led Sri Lanka to where it is now. But there is also another element that I'm sure you and our viewers would agree is a key reason why Sri Lanka is currently in the dumps, so to speak. And that is not appointing certain professionals to high and top positions based on meritocracy. Political appointments, aides of certain political leaders being appointed to decision-making bodies. This is something that has run rampant in Sri Lanka and has also at times led to institutions that they have governed being run down to the ground. I want to start off tonight's show by talking to you on that topic.
Thanks, Jamal. So I think we can talk about the latest appointment to the Bank of Ceylon, the chairman of the Bank of Ceylon.
Right.
As you mentioned, institutions. Sri Lanka has many institutions. Part of the reason for Sri Lanka's economic collapse and policy failures has been the failure of the institutions itself to stand up and be counted when it was most important.
Yes.
Now, this appointment, I don't mean to denigrate the appointee, his professional record and where he's worked before. That's not the question.
Right.
The appointment is inappropriate because of the relationship that he has. He's the brother of the chief of staff of the president.
Right.
The president is also the finance minister. He's also the defense minister. And this is happening in a context where we've seen recently even details of bad loans at the state banks given to SOEs, politically connected people, associates of politically connected people. Yes. And in such a context, I think just in a few weeks ago, some of the loans that some of the debts of Sri Lankan Airlines that were taken up by the taxpayer were also from some of the state banks, correct? So in such a context, when we know that there is a politicization of the banking sector, this is an extremely inappropriate appointment, right? And it goes against all the basic principles of governance and ethics.
Right.
And I'm also very surprised, I have to say to the audience as well, I used to work in banking. I was in banking in Sri Lanka for 10 years. I've worked abroad in banking as well. Sri Lanka has, I think, the Association of Professional Bankers. It's got a few other professional bodies related to the banking industry. So I asked the audience, where are these institutions, right? Where are the top bankers, the members of the banking fraternity, even the retired bankers? I think people should be speaking up against this because, and just take a look at the person he's replacing. The person he's replacing, the previous chairman of the Bank of Ceylon, also had to leave his job because he's joining the steering committee of the UNP's election campaign.
Right.
So that's the previous chairman and the current chairman, both being political appointees. Now, I understand the audience might be thinking, well, political appointees like this are quite on par for Sri Lanka, right? But I think we have to accept that we are living in the post-2022 era, in the post-Aragale era, where we now understand the impacts of faulty governance and what it can do to our country and our economy and our society.
Yes.
So in such a situation, I mean, the IMF itself has a governance diagnostic report out. And so in the face of all this, for the government to make such appointments, I have to also ask, I think, Jamal, as a political analyst, someone that's in the media, I try to stay away from commenting too much on the central bank, the operations of the central bank and the central bank governor itself. I think it's very dangerous to politicize these things. But in this same month where we had, those increments at the central bank, which we can also talk about, an increment that on one sense you could say has no basis, but then on the other hand you ask the question, how did they come up with these increments? In such a situation today, where with this appointment, it's my understanding that the central bank has to approve such appointments to director boards and chairmanships. Right. So where is the central bank in terms of this appointment? Why aren't they raising doubts about I mean, it's a clear political appointment. It's not good for governance, but yet I didn't hear anything from the central bank, from the governor of the central bank. I saw, in fact, a news item in the Daily FT yesterday where I think there was an event with the Association of Professional Bankers and the Governor Nandalal in attendance.
Right.
So I think there's a bit of a problem. I think most people in the audience will accept these relationships that we have with industry and with government. This is part of the reason we are in this mess. And even 2 years on from a once-in-a-generation economic collapse, we can still see these appointments that should not be happening. Especially we are in a structural adjustment program. People are suffering, right? And I don't see any sort of effort being made at correcting such obvious governance deficits. So I think I would ask the audience to have a think about this, because 2 years on from the economic collapse, what has really changed in our country? We have MP Rohita Abhigunawardene as the chairman of the COPE. I think hundreds of billions of rupees were transferred onto the taxpayer from Sri Lankan Airlines without so much as a 2-page report on what happened to Sri Lankan Airlines. What is the trajectory of this national carrier?
Yeah.
We don't have any answers to any of this. We can pull little bits of information from the media, but this is something that should have been done with great sort of wide buy-in from the public. But instead, the cabinet just signed a paper and told the people to think. Now, I understand the people have to absorb this debt. There's probably no way to do it. But there is a way to do it, Jaimal.
Yes.
And in this current context, in this climate, I think these are all very worrying things, and I ask the audience to keep an eye on these things.
Right. So sticking to the same topic, Kusum, you said that we live in the post-Aragale era, the post-2022 era. And one of the key aspects of the Aragale was to bring about a system change in the country. Governance, reducing corruption, appointing clean and accountable authorities or individuals to positions of power. And back then, immediately after 2022's Aragale, if such an appointment was made, the people were very aware of it. The people would step out onto the roads and show their dissent, or political figures from the opposition would come forward and voice their opposition. But we don't see such an uproar recently regarding this particular appointment. So do you believe normal service has resumed once more in Sri Lanka?
I don't want to say normal service is resumed. I want to give the electorate more credit than that. I just think that the power centers in Sri Lanka are very comfortable at the moment, right? Because we don't have the material issues like no electricity, fuel queues, so a lack of goods in the supermarkets. So there's a certain segment of the middle class that takes some comfort from this, and rightfully so, right? Things have obviously improved.
Yes.
But you have to always dig a little deeper, right? So the circumstances and the lack of governance and the lack of basic ethics and principles that led to this situation, they still exist. They still prevail where we are. I mean, Gotabaya Rajapaksa came to power in 2019. He started implementing his manifesto in 2020. Between 2020 and 2022, did you see a long queue of people from the central bank that was responsible for the money printing and the increases in debt? Did you see finance ministry officials that were responsible for the tax cuts? Did you see them retire? Did come out and resign? Did you see them release statements? No, we didn't see any of that, right? And this is the problem. You cannot have people sitting in institutions and protecting themselves. If you're in an institution with some power, you have to stand up and be counted when it matters, right? And this is the failure. So this is a failure that's happened right down from members of the cabinet who are still on the cabinet, who were on Gotabaya's cabinet, who were shaking, who probably shook their heads and voted for the tax cuts, voted for the agriculture policy. A lot of them are still in government. So I think the people are right to ask questions. We are taking a certain amount of slack. We are paying VAT. We are paying high income taxes. Our standards of living has significantly reduced. What is the cost to the political class? What has been the cost? There has been no discernible cost to them. And I think this government we know elections are a hot topic. Even in the UK, I saw Rishi Sunak evading a question regarding a general election. And I think even in Sri Lanka right now, there's no date set, but I think we're all pretty confident in a presidential election happening in this year. But my point is that this should have happened before. I mean, general election should have happened before. We've let it come to this stage. The fact that we have Rohit Abhigunaradan as the chairman of the COPE tells you everything you need to know, right? It's the fact that you see, I mean, if you watch I watch your news program, when you see the Sri Lankan Airlines meetings going on, who is heading the meeting, who is central to that meeting? The Cabinet Minister Nimal Siripala de Silva. Can you find me a minister that is more emblematic of Sri Lanka's political failings than MP Nimal Siripala de Silva? And yet he is central to one of the most important restructurings for Sri Lanka's economy.
Yes.
So I have to say, this would be funny if it wasn't so serious, right? We are heading for a situation where this IMF program, we don't have a choice. I would challenge anyone to tell us once you default on debt, there is no route other than the IMF. But I think the problem we have with the commentary and a lot of economists and people in the media is that we're looking at the IMF as one of two things. Either some evil foreign external power that's going to take over the country, some neo-colonialist institution, or we're looking at the IMF as the be-all and end-all of policy in Sri Lanka, right? People have to understand the IMF is not a development partner, right? The IMF is a liquidity insolvency partner or a fiscal consolidation partner. To think of them as a development partner, I think, is a mistake, right? Because they are interested in making sure that we are fiscally stable, sure. Is that the be-all and end-all of economics? No, we have to develop our economy, we have to grow our economy, we have to expand. We're not going to meet revenue targets if our income is decreasing, right? So I think there has to be a fundamental change in the coming year in how we view our economic setup. Even if the audience is very happy with everything this government has done, ask yourself the question, at the end of this IMF program, Jaimal, we will have, in 2027, at the end of this program, we are scheduled to have debt to GDP of over 115%. Right? We will have more debt than we have today. The whole purpose of the IMF program is to get us back into capital markets, into buying, investing in bonds. So we have to think about where we are headed. The IMF's own projections give us a massive trade deficit in 2027. So how are we going to finance that trade deficit? So, and the revenue initiatives that the government has taken, some of them are commendable, but we still don't see a top marginal rate of income tax. We don't see a wealth tax. We don't see capital gains taxes. What we do see are VAT, which everybody has to pay. So I just think that the fundamental trajectory of this economic policy that this government has put forward, it's not going to lead us anywhere good. And then when people react, when people get angry, when they start casting votes for populist leaders and demagogues and people that have all these fancy ideas, don't turn around and blame the voter, because they gave you the opportunity to provide them some solutions. What did you do? You did the same thing that you did in 2015, the same thing you did in 2017. The IMF told us in 2016, fix your revenue problem, broaden your tax base. Here we are 8 years later, the government and Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe is saying, yeah, we need to broaden our tax base. Yes, he was in power between 2015 and 2019. What did he do? I think the Inland Revenue Act of 2018 was an improvement. Did it go far enough? No, our debt to tax revenue to GDP during the Yapalani period was 15%. And that was at the tail end after all the reforms had taken place. It's just not enough. We're not going to get anywhere with that kind of tax revenue.
Right. So, speaking about the IMF, I think it was you who had shed light regarding the IMF many decades on apologizing for the severe austerity measures they had recommended for Greece when Greece was bankrupt. And now, based on the meeting that was held a couple of weeks back, the President has agreed to table the technical assistance reports that the IMF based itself to provide the recommendations it did for Sri Lanka's extended fund facility program. So, do you believe there will be any sort of significant outcome even if the technical assistance reports are received now? Do you think the horse has bolted and it's too late for us to close the stable door?
No, I wouldn't say it's too late. Look, for your audience, in 2008, 2009, the Greek economy collapsed, and the IMF provided one of the largest loans in human history, something like 300 million euros to Greece, right? And of course, the conditionalities for that facility were extreme austerity, cuts to social security nets, cuts in government spending. And 4 years later, the IMF came out and released a statement apologizing for the very policies that it recommended to Greece, because they said that they didn't expect the impact of austerity to be so severe. They were over-optimistic on the growth. They underestimated the damage it caused to the economy, and they admitted it. Right? In fact, it's happened before. I mean, the IMF is... I'm not trying to denigrate the IMF or anything, but it is an organization that is learning.
Yes.
It's evolving.
It is
right?
not an all-seeing God.
Yes, it's its own discourse with Sri Lanka when it comes to the social safety net, SSN, and the cash transfers. This discourse is something that's developed and evolved because of its previous issues. When it was Ukraine in 1990, in 2014, it was the Asian financial crisis in 1997, Argentina in 2000. In all these instances, I asked the audience to go and look it up. The IMF made mistakes, it admitted to mistakes, and it then revised its conditionalities. So there is no guarantee that these things will work. We have to work with the IMF on a good faith basis. But we can't expect the IMF to be the magical solution to this.
Yes.
We have to come up with our own solution, Jaimal. Our government has to come up with policies to grow our exports, to increase our revenue, to reduce our costs, and to increase labor productivity. I don't see any of this happening with the government. All they're doing is biding their time and giving out a few. I think the previous the governor of the central bank, Governor Indrajit Kumaraswamy, made the comment that he sees a little bit of a divergence because of some election giveaways.
Yes.
And this is this any different to what was there before?
Previously.
I mean, other than the name change of the president. Has the modus operandi really changed?
Yes.
I don't think so.
Right. So, coming back to a topic that you touched upon a few minutes ago, you spoke about the salary hikes at the central bank.
Yes,
You've been a banker, so you know what sort of pay scales exist within the banking sector. So, very quickly tell me, do you believe the salary hikes that have been recommended are unfounded or justified?
Jaimal, it's very tricky because are wages at an acceptable level for anybody in Sri Lanka? I think the question is no, right? You can't have inflation of 70% and not have wage increases and say everything's fine. No, wages have to go up. So the question is, okay, why are some wages going up and others not? So what is special about the central bank? Okay, fine. Some in the central bank deserve 70% increments. But then take a look at the increments that were given. The people with the lowest salary, something like 40,000 rupees, were getting a 23% increment. The people with 6 lakhs a month are getting 75% increment. So again, that raises a different question. Well, how are you choosing this increment scale? I think the professionals at the central bank should be paid a good wage, a reasonable wage. I think you have to justify. I don't think asking questions is necessarily interfering with the independence of the central bank either. I think it's a fair thing to ask.
Certainly.
You have to answer the questions though. You can't say, no, this is what the decision we have taken based on X, Y, and Z. Okay, if the central bank can afford 70% increments, what about the other state institutions? What about other organizations? What about the private institutions? What about the conglomerates? They make billions in profits. Have they given 70% increases? I think it opens up a can of worms. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing these questions are asked, because at the end of the day, I don't think costs are going to come down by 70%, Jaimal. So wages will have to go up at some point, right? Otherwise, we're just going to be stuck in this spiral.
Right. So moving on to something that caught a lot of people's attention and caught a lot of people by surprise also several weeks ago. Former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's book that came out a couple of weeks ago and mentions that he had made as to why his regime failed, and he was made to vacate his position as the president. He goes on to say that there was a conspiracy behind him being ousted, and he also goes on to name some figures even in his government that had allegedly contributed to this particular reason. But one thing we must remember is former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa was the commander-in-chief, and he had all the authority to ensure that such a conspiracy did not occur. And one question that a lot of people have come up with is, for someone who was paraded to be a champion of diffusing terrorism in Sri Lanka, for someone who will save and protect Sri Lanka from terrorism, being ousted through an international conspiracy. What do you think about that, being an analyst yourself?
I mean, I haven't read the book, I have to admit. Will I read the book? Probably not. And with all due respect to the former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, there's a satirical Twitter page, I think you're familiar with, the News Curry. So they call the conspiracy, the Gotabaya conspiracy, the Gonspiracy. Right. And I think that's very apt. Because, and I think he'd be surprised, because some of the people that he's mentioned in his administration that he blames for some of the things that happened were actually some of the people that had the most public trust, like former army commander, members of the military, etc. So, I think we have to understand that when a president fails, and not just fails completely spectacularly, he has to make up some kind of excuse. So I would tell people to just ignore this. This is part of a news cycle. If you're the kind of person who's going to read Gotabaya Rajapaksa's book for anything other than comedic relief, you should probably pick up the former governor Ajit Nibad Cabral's book as well, if you really want comic relief. But I want to ask, since you mentioned this conspiracy thing, I want to just quickly touch, I don't know, we don't have much time, but think about this, right? Ranil Wickremesinghe and the UNP were democratically rejected at the last election. Right, Ranil Wickremesinghe was given the signal in no uncertain terms that the Sri Lankan people don't want him in a position of leadership. That was in 2020. So 4 years later, ask yourself how the UNP and Ranil Wickremesinghe have more power than they've ever had in their history since Ranil Wickremesinghe took over the UNP. To me, that seems like a little bit of a conspiracy that someone needs. So how do you get democratically rejected and yet 4 years later end up with more power than you've ever had, where you can impact the economy, society in ways that when you have no mandate, it's quite perverse to have this happening, and I think that people need to ask, these are, it's in plain sight, but no one really seems to ask the question, why is this? How can you be rejected by the people and still end up in a position of power? To me, that's the conspiracy.
Right. So very quickly, because we are pressed for time, I must ask you, because you're a foreign analyst and you are aware of what is happening when concerning big major players in the world, and also a bit of relation to former President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's book regarding certain foreign nations that had conspired to oust him from presidency. Should the Samagizana Balawegaya come to power, what sort of measures will you take to ensure that Sri Lanka does not witness such a conspiracy once more, that foreign powers allegedly do not tamper with Sri Lanka's sovereignty?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to be cognizant of the threats and the incentives that foreign powers have for being involved in Sri Lanka. You have to know what they're looking for, and you have to know what your own interests are. So I think in that case, we have something very interesting coming up in about a month's time in India, the start of the Indian elections, right? We are in India's sphere of influence. I've mentioned this many, many times. This is India's neighborhood. We know India's, just watch the news, India's getting intertwined with Sri Lanka more and more as we go along, right? Certainly. So I think that's something to look out for. The polling suggests that Prime Minister Modi is going to win, but the question is, I think he was in Tamil Nadu just this week, and he's been making a lot of trips south. It's called the Look South campaign. So let's see what happens, because we know the Indian fishing issue, we know the Kachativu Island issue. These are all peripheral issues, but the main issue is the 13th Amendment, and the main issue is Sri Lanka's project for devolution and reconciliation. So what kind of promises Mr. Modi will extract, or will the Tamil Nadu governments extract from Prime Minister Modi to support him in the election? We know that the centre-Tamil Nadu relationship has a certain dynamic as well. I think the leader of the DMK has been very strong on critical of Prime Minister Modi. So it will be interesting to see how Indian government policy towards Sri Lanka's 13th Amendment and devolution changes once he's re-elected, if he's indeed re-elected. So I think that's something to watch out for.
And maybe China, we'll touch upon it.
I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that the Chinese economy has been having a lot of headwinds recently. They've had a property issue, they've had lower than expected consumer activity, they have their own debt issues. So I think the Chinese economy in this coming period, it's about stabilizing. So this may be part of the reason why we also haven't heard from them regarding debt restructuring. We haven't heard more details about it. So we have to keep an eye on it. So remember that I just mentioned we are getting closer and closer to India, where there's a lot of intertwining happening. That has an impact on our relationship with China, right? So the whole Mahinda Rajapaksa foreign policy was about bringing in China as a bulwark against India, so that we can sort of delay and distract from
and have a certain bargaining power,
and we can distract from the 13th Amendment and devolution of power and things. So it's coming time where Sri Lankan administrations can no longer kick this can down the road. I think we'll have to make some decisions, and one can only hope that any future Sri Lankan government will make these decisions with some significant public mandate, because that's really important. You don't want to sign agreements. For example, the 2015 co-sponsorship of the UN resolution at the UNHRC, that was a mistake because it was hugely unpopular. It gave the opportunity for the ultranationalists to system. So we have to be very careful about how we tread those waters.
Right. So yet another interesting episode of Face to Face concludes. My guest tonight was Kusum Wijetilleke, Working Committee member of the SJP. Thank you very much, Kusum, for joining me yet again, sharing your very candid views on everything from the economy to politics to foreign relations. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today on Face to Face. Do take care and have yourselves a great Monday night.